The lock on the east wing door didn't click. It ground against the strike plate like bone on stone. For 7 years, that sound meant a tray of cold mutton and pitying glances from the maids. It meant isolation. But tonight, the footsteps on the stairs were too heavy. The breathing on the other side of the oak was too even. When the brass knob finally turned, it wasn't the housekeeper. It was a man looking for a ghost. The air in the east wing always tasted of stale lavender and neglect. It was a dry, powdery flavor that settled on the back of the tongue, no matter how many times Imogen opened the narrow leaded window at the far end of her chamber. She sat in the window seat now, the heavy velvet drapes pulled tightly around her shoulders like a shroud to ward off the November draft. In her lap lay a pear, its skin bruised a deep mottled purple. She pressed her thumb into the softest spot, feeling the skin yield with a wet, quiet tear. The juice that leaked onto her knuckle was sweet, but she didn't eat it. She just rolled the ruined fruit between her palms, watching the carriages pull up the gravel drive 3 stories below. They looked like black beetles crawling through the frost. The Ashcroft estate was ablaze with light, a beacon of desperate hospitality. Lord Thomas Ashcroft, Imogen's father, was hosting a dinner that bordered on a theatrical production. The prize of the evening was arriving in the carriage currently halting beneath the portico. Simon, Duke of Alderley. Imogen leaned her forehead against the freezing glass pane. The cold felt good. It numbed the tight, puckered skin on the left side of her face. From her temple down to her jawline, her flesh was a violent topography of burn scars, ridged, shiny, and stretched taut. It had happened 7 years ago. A dropped oil lamp, a rug soaked in kerosene, and a father who cared more about saving his antique tapestries than his eldest daughter. When the bandages had finally come off, Lord Ashcroft had taken one look at her face, turned entirely gray, and walked out of the room. The next week her belongings were moved to the east wing. For her own comfort, he had told the staff. The poor girl cannot bear the shock of company. It was a lie, of course. Imogen had wanted company. She had wanted to walk in the gardens, even if people stared. But a disfigured daughter was a liability to a man looking to secure a brilliant marriage for his second, unblemished child, Clara. So the heavy iron bolt was installed on the outside of the east wing door. Below, the carriage door opened. Imogen squinted through the distorted, rippled glass of her window. A man stepped out. He didn't wait for the footman to assist him, brushing past the servant with a sharp, impatient gesture. Even from 3 stories up, Imogen could see he was not the polished, powdered sort of aristocrat her father usually courted. Simon of Alderley was a man of northern industry, coal, steel, and textiles. He was built like a dock worker shoved into an immaculate evening coat. He paused on the gravel, looking up. Imogen shrank back, her heart performing a dull, heavy thump against her ribs. She knew he couldn't see her. The window was dark, the room unlit save for a single stub of tallow candle on her washstand. Yet, for a second, she felt entirely exposed. She turned away from the window, dropping the bruised pear onto a chipped porcelain plate on her desk. The room was large, once a grand nursery, but the furniture was a collection of rejects from the main house. A wardrobe with a missing foot that leaned drunkenly against the floral wallpaper, a writing desk scarred with ink stains, a narrow bed piled with scratchy woolen blankets. Faintly, through the floorboards, the agonizingly cheerful scrape of a string quartet tuning their instruments drifted upward. The vibrations hummed in the soles of her worn leather slippers. Imogen walked to the washstand and peered into the cracked mirror propped against the wall. She turned her head to the right. Smooth, pale skin, a sharp jawline, an arched dark eyebrow over an amber eye. She looked like her mother. Then she turned her head to the left. The amber eye on that side was permanently pulled downward by the tension of the scar tissue. The skin was mottled pink and pearlescent white, bare of any eyebrow, the cheekbone buried under thick, uneven flesh. She hated the left side of her face, but she hated the right side more. The right side was a constant, mocking reminder of what she was supposed to be. She reached for a length of black bombazine cloth lying on the bed. When the maids came, or when she was allowed a brief supervised walk in the walled kitchen garden at dawn, she wore it pinned across her hair, dropping over the ruined half of her face. She picked it up, the cheap fabric rough against her fingertips. She didn't put it on. She threw it back onto the mattress. "Let them play their games," she muttered to the empty room, her voice a rough rasp from disuse. She sat at her desk, pulled a piece of charcoal from a tin box, and began to sketch a grotesque, exaggerated caricature of her father, bowing to a man made entirely of smokestacks. She pressed so hard the charcoal snapped, burying a splinter of black under her fingernail. The dining room below smelled overpoweringly of roasted meats, heavy claret, and Clara Ashcroft's rosewater perfume. Simon, Duke of Alderley, sat at the right hand of his host, methodically cutting his venison into perfectly uniform squares. He had eaten exactly 3 pieces. He had no intention of eating a 4th. "The Northern Rail expansion, Your Grace," Lord Ashcroft was saying, his voice entirely too loud, a sheen of nervous sweat on his upper lip. "I have it on good authority that the Crown plans to subsidize the route through my lands in Derbyshire. It would be a mutually beneficial arrangement for your steel mills." Simon kept his eyes on his plate. Ashcroft was lying. The man's Derbyshire lands were a swamp, heavily mortgaged and entirely unsuited for rail. Ashcroft didn't want a business partner. He wanted a bailout, and he was offering up his simpering daughter as collateral. Simon glanced across the table. Clara was beautiful in an entirely forgettable way, blonde, pink-cheeked, and dressed in a pale blue silk that looked expensive but felt contrived. She caught his eye and offered a smile so practiced it looked painful. "Do you enjoy music, Your Grace?" Clara asked, her voice breathy. "I was hoping to play the pianoforte for you after supper." "I have a tin ear, Lady Clara," Simon replied. His voice was flat, carrying the gravelly burr of the north that he had never bothered to train out of his accent. "The result of a cannon firing too close to my head in Belgium. All music sounds like cats fighting in a sack to me." Clara's smile faltered, her eyes darting to her father in panic. Lord Ashcroft let out a loud, forced laugh. "A marvelous sense of humor, Your Grace. Marvelous." Simon took a sip of his wine. It was sour. He felt a dull ache throbbing in his left knee, another souvenir from the war, exacerbated by the damp chill of the manor house. Despite the roaring fires, Ashcroft Manor felt hollow. The opulence was a thin veneer over rot. Simon had spent his life pulling wealth from the dirt. He knew a collapsing mine when he saw one. "Excuse me," Simon said, dropping his heavy linen napkin onto his half-eaten venison. He stood, his chair scraping loudly against the parquet floor. "I require some air." "Oh, but the dessert," Lord Ashcroft began, half rising. "Air, Ashcroft," Simon repeated, not looking back. He limped out of the dining room, ignoring the footman who scrambled to open the double doors. The main hallway was aggressively lit with gas lamps, making the gold leaf molding scream for attention. Simon ignored the front doors. It was raining outside, a miserable, freezing sleet. Instead, he turned toward the back of the house, seeking the quietest, darkest corridor he could find. He walked for several minutes, the sounds of the dinner party fading into a muffled murmur. He passed a portrait gallery filled with stiff-necked ancestors, his boots echoing sharply on the uncarpeted floorboards. The air here was cooler, lacking the heavy scent of wax and perfume. It smelled real, dust, old wood, and the faint coppery tang of damp stone. He reached the end of the corridor. It terminated at a narrow, steep staircase leading upward. The carpet on the stairs had been removed, leaving only the brass tacks embedded in the scarred wood. Curiosity, a trait that had made him rich and frequently unpopular, flared. An unadorned staircase in a house desperate to show off its wealth. He began to climb, favoring his bad leg, his hand trailing along the peeling wallpaper. The landing at the top was pitch black. Simon pulled a silver match safe from his waistcoat pocket, struck a Vesta, and held it up. The small yellow flame illuminated a short, dead-end hallway. There was only one door. It was made of heavy, solid oak. But what caught Simon's eye was not the door itself, but the hardware. A massive iron hasp had been bolted into the wood and the stone frame. Hanging from it was a heavy brass padlock. The lock was fastened on the outside. Simon stepped closer, the match burning down toward his fingertips. He smelled it then. Wood smoke. Not the clean, cured oak burning in the parlor downstairs, but a thin, acrid smell of a poorly ventilated chimney. Someone had a fire going in there. A lock on the outside, a fire on the inside. He pinched the match out, plunging the hallway back into darkness. He stood perfectly still, controlling his breathing, listening. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then he heard it. The faint, unmistakable sound of a heavy object, a book perhaps, being dropped onto a wooden surface, followed by a quiet, irritated sigh. Simon frowned in the dark. Ashcroft wasn't hiding silver or documents in there. He was hiding a person. The pragmatic, cynical part of his brain told him to turn around, walk down the stairs, order his carriage, and leave this pathetic, desperate family to their secrets. It wasn't his business, but as he turned, his boot scuffed against a loose floorboard. It let out a loud, sharp crack. Inside the room, the faint rustling stopped instantly. A heavy, terrified silence fell over the door. It wasn't the silence of an empty room. It was the vibrating, taut silence of a trapped animal holding its breath. Simon slowly reached out and wrapped his large, calloused hand around the brass padlock. It was cold and covered in a fine layer of dust. But as he pulled on it, he felt the hasp give slightly. The screws holding the iron plate into the rotting oak doorframe were loose. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a savior. But he detested locked doors, and he detested Lord Ashcroft. Simon tightened his grip, braced his good leg against the doorframe, and pulled. Imogen froze. The chunk of charcoal slipped from her fingers, rolling across the desk and dropping onto the floor with a tiny tap. Someone was outside her door. It wasn't Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper. Mrs. Gable walked with a shuffling gait, her heavy skirts swishing against the walls. It wasn't one of the scullery maids. They always chattered nervously to each other when they brought her food, terrified of the East Wing ghost. This footstep had been heavy, singular, and deliberate. She sat paralyzed in the wooden chair, her breath trapped high in her chest. Her eyes darted toward the door. The thick oak was a solid black rectangle against the gloom of her room. She waited for the sound of a key grinding in the lock. She waited for her father's sharp, impatient voice commanding her to turn her face to the wall before he entered. Instead, there was a deafening crack of splintering wood, followed by the metallic clatter of heavy iron hitting the floorboards. Imogen's hands flew to her face, a reflex she hadn't managed to kill in 7 years. Her fingers dug into the scarred flesh of her left cheek, her nails biting into the numb tissue. She hadn't put her veil on. The bombazine cloth was still lying uselessly on the bed across the room. The brass doorknob slowly turned. The hinges, unoiled for a decade, let out a high, agonizing squeal that made Imogen's teeth ache. The door pushed inward. The light from the hallway, dim as it was from the sconce at the bottom of the stairs, spilled into her room like a physical intrusion. It cut across the dusty floor, illuminating the moth-eaten rug and the chipped legs of her desk. A shadow filled the doorway, a massive, broad-shouldered silhouette. Imogen stood up so fast her chair tipped backward, crashing to the floor. She backed away, her spine hitting the icy plaster of the wall beside the window. She pressed herself against it, trying to merge with the shadows. The man stepped into the room. He didn't carry a candle. He let the ambient light from the hall wash over him. Imogen recognized the broad chest, the impeccably tailored but slightly rumpled evening coat, the square jaw. It was the Duke of Alderley, the man her father was currently trying to sell Clara to. Simon stood just inside the threshold, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom. The room smelled of cold ash and cheap soap. It was freezing. "Who's there?" Simon's voice was a low rumble, devoid of fear, laced only with a hard, demanding curiosity. Imogen couldn't speak. Her throat had closed entirely. She kept her hands clamped over the left side of her face, her right eye wide and panicked, staring at him. Simon took a step further in. His foot crunched on the piece of charcoal she had dropped. He looked down at the floor, then up at the walls, taking in the peeling wallpaper, the sparse furniture, the narrow, pathetic bed. Finally, his gaze locked onto the corner by the window. He saw her. A woman, painfully thin, wearing a dress of faded, washed-out gray wool that looked 5 years out of fashion. She was pressed against the wall like a moth pinned to a board. Her dark hair was loose, tumbling over her shoulders in a wild, unbrushed mass. One hand was clamped firmly over her face. Simon didn't gasp. He didn't demand to know her name. He simply stopped, his posture relaxing infinitesimally. "I apologize," Simon said. The gravel in his voice was softer now. "I seem to have broken your lock. Though, judging by the fact it was on the outside, I doubt you had the key." Imogen blinked. The sheer banal practicality of his statement shocked her system, jarring her out of her blind panic. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't asking what she was doing here. He was observing the mechanics of her imprisonment. "You shouldn't be here," Imogen managed to whisper. Her voice cracked, rough as sandpaper. "I shouldn't be downstairs either," Simon replied, taking one more step into the room. He stopped abruptly when he saw her flinch. "I was told this wing was structurally unsound, a danger to inhabit." "It is," Imogen said, her fingers trembling against her jaw. "The roof leaks in the spring. You need to leave." Simon tilted his head, studying her. The weak light from the hallway caught the edge of her right profile, the high cheekbone, the flawless skin, the large, terrified amber eye. "Lord Ashcroft is a terrible liar," Simon noted quietly. "He told me he had only one daughter." A bitter, humorless bark of laughter ripped from Imogen's throat before she could stop it. The sudden movement caused her hand to slip. The fingers covering her face dragged downward. She realized her mistake instantly, but her muscles were locked. She couldn't raise her hand back up in time. Simon had taken another step forward, pulling a silver Vesta case from his pocket again. He struck a match against the wall to get a better look at his surroundings. The sulfur flared bright and yellow, throwing harsh, dancing shadows across the room. The light hit Imogen full in the face. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for it. The sharp intake of breath, the recoil, the look of revulsion that always started in the eyes and twisted the mouth downward. She braced her shoulders, preparing for the inevitable horror that she had seen 100 times from maids, from tutors, from her own father. But the silence stretched. The hiss of the burning match was the only sound in the room. Imogen opened her right eye. Simon was standing 4 feet away. The match was burning down toward his thumb, illuminating his face. He wasn't recoiling. He was leaning forward slightly. His dark eyes were fixed on the left side of her face, tracking the violent ridges of the burn scars, the tight, shiny pull of the skin around her ruined cheek. His expression wasn't horrified. It was intensely, almost uncomfortably, analytical. "Oil fire?" he asked abruptly. Imogen flinched, shocked by the directness. "Kerosene," she whispered. "Takes hotter than wood to melt skin like that," Simon muttered, almost to himself. He finally shook the match out as it reached his skin, dropping the blackened stick onto the floorboards. "I've seen it in the steel mills." A man caught a splash of molten slag across the shoulder, looked much the same. Imogen stared at him, entirely disarmed. He had equated her deepest, most shameful trauma to a mill worker's occupational hazard. There was no pity in his voice, no disgust, only cold, hard fact. "You're not disgusted," she said. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Simon let out a short, tired breath. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a silver flask. He unscrewed the cap, took a swig, and held it out toward her. "I've spent the last hour listening to your father try to sell me a swamp and watching your sister pretend she doesn't find me repulsive," Simon said, his tone utterly flat. "Compared to the rot downstairs, a bit of scarred tissue is the most honest thing I've seen all night." He kept the flask extended. "Now," Simon said, looking her directly in her mismatched eyes. "Are you going to stay standing against that wall like a frightened child? Or are you going to tell me exactly why Lord Ashcroft keeps a grown woman locked in a freezing room with a padlock on the outside?" The silver flask hung in the space between them, glinting faintly in the gloom. Imogen stared at it. It was a heavy, battered thing, the engraving on its side worn entirely smooth by the friction of a thumb. The rational part of her brain, the part conditioned by 7 years of locked doors and lowered eyes, screamed at her to refuse. To retreat to the bed, pull the scratchy wool blankets over her head, and wait for this loud, blunt man to leave. But her throat was terribly dry, and the air in the room was so incredibly cold. She pushed off the wall. Her legs felt weak, the joints stiff from hours sitting by the drafty window. She closed the distance between them, her worn leather slippers making no sound on the floorboards. She reached out. Her fingers brushed his. His skin was incredibly warm, rough with calluses that didn't belong on a duke. Imogen snatched the flask and retreated 2 quick steps, clutching the cool metal to her chest. Simon didn't move. He just watched her, his hands dropping to hang loosely at his sides. Imogen unscrewed the cap. The smell hit her first, sharp, peaty, and entirely masculine. It smelled like wet earth and old fires. She brought it to her lips and tipped it back. She had never tasted spirits before. The whiskey hit the back of her throat like a lit match. She choked, a harsh, tearing cough ripping from her lungs. Her eyes watered instantly, stinging with hot tears. She doubled over slightly, gasping for breath, the flask dangling precariously from her grip. "Small sips," Simon noted dryly. "It's not tea." Imogen wheezed, wiping her mouth with the back of her trembling hand. "You might have warned me," she managed to croak. "I assumed a woman who survives in a meat locker possessed a hardy constitution." Despite the burning in her chest, a strange, creeping warmth began to unfurl in her stomach. It radiated outward, loosening the tight, panicked knot behind her ribs. She looked at him, her right eye narrowed. "I am Imogen Ashcroft." Simon processed the name. The heavy line of his jaw shifted slightly as he ground his teeth. "The eldest, the one who contracted a severe wasting fever and died in Italy 5 years ago, or so the society papers reported." "I have never been to Italy," Imogen said flatly, "though I imagine it is warmer than Derbyshire. Considerably." Simon stepped further into the room, his eyes scanning the dismal surroundings. He looked at the meager fire laid in the grate, 3 pathetic sticks of damp kindling and a lump of low-grade coal. "Do they intend to freeze you to death, or is the cold supposed to preserve you?" "The coal ration is delivered on Tuesdays," Imogen said, defensive out of pure habit. "I must make it last." Simon didn't reply. He walked over to the overturned wooden chair Imogen had knocked down in her panic. Without a word, he placed his heavy boot on the rung and pressed down. The dry, rotted wood let out a loud groan and snapped. Imogen gasped, stepping back. "What are you doing? Mrs. Gable will inventory the furniture." "Mrs. Gable can send the bill to Alderley," Simon interrupted. He systematically broke the chair down into manageable pieces, his large hands snapping the spindles like twigs. He gathered the splintered wood, walked to the fireplace, and knelt. He ignored the damp kindling entirely, piling the dry, lacquered chair legs over the miserable lump of coal. He struck another match. The varnish caught almost immediately. A bright, cheerful, hungry flame leaped up the chimney, casting a brilliant orange glow over the room. The sudden heat was a physical shock. Simon stayed kneeling on the filthy hearth, indifferent to the soot ruining his tailored trousers. He looked over his shoulder at her. "Bring the flask. Come sit." He gestured to the floor in front of the fire. There was nowhere else to sit. He had just destroyed the only chair. Imogen hesitated. The firelight was too bright. It would highlight every shiny ridge, every tight pull of scar tissue on her face. She usually spent her evenings in near-total darkness precisely to avoid seeing herself in the washstand mirror. "I am not a museum exhibit," Simon said, reading her hesitation with infuriating accuracy. "I won't stare. Unless you plan to burst into flames, in which case I will be forced to put you out, and I have a bad knee. So sit." It was a completely unromantic, gruff demand. It was the best thing anyone had said to her in years. Imogen moved to the hearth. She didn't sit entirely beside him. She kept a careful 3 feet of distance, pulling her knees to her chest and wrapping her faded skirts around her ankles. She held the flask out to him. Simon took it, his fingers brushing hers again, and took a long, even swallow. He capped it and set it on the floor stones between them. 7 years, Imogen said to the flames. The whiskey had loosened her tongue just a fraction. "Since the fire." "And he locked you away immediately?" "Not immediately. He waited until the bandages came off." Imogen rested her chin on her knees. The heat of the fire was making her scarred skin itch, a tight, unpleasant sensation, but the warmth soaking into her bones was heavenly. "He said my appearance would terrify the staff. Then, when Clara came of age, he said it would ruin her prospects. Who would marry into a bloodline with such a monstrosity sitting at the dinner table?" "A monstrously stupid man," Simon replied. Imogen looked at him sharply. "My father?" "Anyone who cares about a scar when evaluating a ledger." Simon leaned back on his hand, stretching his bad leg out in front of him with a wince. "Beauty is a depreciating asset, Imogen. It rots, it wrinkles, it fades. A sharp mind and a strong spine hold their value." He turned his head to look at her. The orange light flickered over the harsh angles of his face. "Though, considering your father is currently trying to sell me a tract of worthless marshland to fund his wine cellar, I shouldn't be surprised his valuation of human life is equally flawed." The fire crackled, a loud pop of sap echoing in the quiet room. The smell of burning lacquer was chemical and sweet, masking the stale lavender completely. Simon's gaze drifted from Imogen to the floor near the washstand. He reached out and picked up the piece of charcoal she had dropped. It was crushed on one end from his boot. He rolled it between his thumb and forefinger, leaving a smear of deep black soot on his skin. He looked up at the desk. The dim light reached just far enough to illuminate the scattered papers. Before Imogen could protest, Simon pushed himself up from the floor with a grunt of effort. He limped over to the desk. Imogen's heart spiked. Her drawings were private. They were ugly, vicious things. They weren't the delicate watercolors of birds and flowers that Clara painted in the sunroom. Simon picked up the top sheet of parchment. Imogen squeezed her eyes shut. She braced for the reprimand. Unladylike, grotesque, bitter. A low, rumbling sound vibrated in the room. It took Imogen a full second to realize what it was. Simon was laughing. It wasn't a polite, aristocratic chuckle. It was a rough scraping sound from deep in his chest. He held the paper up to the firelight. It was her sketch from earlier, Lord Ashcroft, his nose elongated into a sharp, rat-like snout, bowing obsequiously to a towering figure made of brick and smokestacks, belching thick black clouds over Ashcroft's perfectly manicured hair. "The resemblance is uncanny," Simon said, his voice thick with genuine amusement. "Particularly the nose. He has been sniffing around my pockets all evening looking exactly like that." Imogen let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. She opened her eyes. "You aren't offended? The smokestack is entirely accurate," Simon said. He lowered the paper, his dark eyes meeting hers. "I'm a man of soot and steel. I don't pretend otherwise. Your father pretends he is a king while his roof caves in. Your drawing is the most honest appraisal of the Ashcroft estate I've seen yet." He placed the drawing gently back on the desk. He didn't treat it like a woman's idle hobby. He handled it like a ledger, a document of truth. He walked back to the fire and sat heavily. He picked up the flask and offered it to her again. This time, Imogen took it without hesitation. She took a smaller sip. The burn was less shocking, the warmth spreading faster. "What do you do in here all day?" Simon asked, leaning his forearms on his knees. "I draw. I read. I look out the window. Imogen traced the grout lines of the hearth with her fingernail. I watched the carriages arrive. I watched yours. You saw me stand in the freezing rain for entirely too long. You looked angry, she noted. I am generally angry, Simon replied, entirely deadpan. It is my default state. It saves time. Imogen felt a tiny, unfamiliar twitch at the corner of her mouth. A smile. It felt foreign. It pulled sharply at the tight skin on her left cheek, a physical reminder of her face. She instantly dropped her head, letting her dark hair fall forward to curtain her profile. Simon saw the movement. He saw the withdrawal. "Stop doing that," he said. His voice was suddenly sharp, not angry, but commanding. Imogen stiffened. "Doing what?" "Hiding." "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice rough. "You saw it in the dark, by a match. When the sun comes up, it is terrifying. The children of the kitchen staff saw me once through the garden gate. They threw stones. Children are feral animals," Simon said dismissively, "and servants are paid to gossip. I am neither." He reached out. His large, rough hand didn't touch her face. Instead, he hooked his index finger under the thick lock of hair she had used to shield her cheek and gently pushed it back behind her ear. Imogen froze, her breath catching in her throat. His knuckles brushed against her unscarred temple. The contact was electric, terrifyingly intimate in the freezing, ruined room. "I told you," Simon said, his voice dropping in volume, vibrating with a low intensity. "I'm a man of the North. We deal in iron, in fire, in things that are broken and reforged. A scar is just proof that the fire didn't win." He pulled his hand back, resting it on his knee. He didn't linger. He didn't make a romantic spectacle of it. He just stated it as a geographical fact. Imogen looked at him, truly looked at him. He was not a handsome man by society's standards. His nose looked as though it had been broken and set poorly. His eyes were too deep set, his jaw too heavy. But sitting there in the dust and the ash, bathed in the orange glow of a burning chair, he looked like a fortress. "Why did you open the door?" she asked softly. Simon looked at the heavy iron hasp lying discarded on the floorboards near the threshold. "Because I hate a cage," he said, "and I despise the man who holds the key." The fire began to burn down, the intense heat mellowing into a steady, comforting warmth. The lacquer on the chair had burned away, leaving only the glowing red embers of the dry wood. Simon reached into his waistcoat and pulled out a heavy gold pocket watch. He snapped the casing open. The metallic click was loud in the quiet room. 10 o'clock, he said, reading the dial. "The dessert course will be concluding. Lord Ashcroft will be steering the men toward the billiards room for brandy and cigars, where he will attempt to trap me into signing a preliminary contract." He snapped the watch shut and returned it to his pocket. He didn't move to stand up. Imogen felt a sudden sharp spike of panic. He was checking the time. He was preparing to leave. The reality of the room, the peeling wallpaper, the locked door, the silence, began to rush back in, pressing against the edges of the fading firelight. Once he walked out that door, he would leave Ashcroft Manor. He would return to the north, and tomorrow her father would see the broken lock. The punishment would be severe. The window would be boarded. The silence would be absolute. "You have to go," Imogen said. Her voice was flat, trying to mask the rising terror. "I do," Simon agreed. He placed his hands on his knees and pushed himself upright, groaning slightly as his bad leg took his weight. He stood over her, a massive shadow against the firelight. He looked at the doorway, then down at Imogen. "I am not putting that lock back on, Imogen." Imogen looked up at him, her amber eyes wide. "He will know. He will know someone found me." "Let him know," Simon said, his voice hardening into steel. "Let him explain to his staff, to his guests, why his dead daughter is sitting in a freezing room on the 3rd floor." "You don't know him," Imogen whispered, panic making her breath shallow. "He will say I am mad. He will send me to an asylum. It is worse than here. Here, I have my window. Here, I have my silence. Simon's jaw tightened. He understood the logistics of power. Ashcroft was a desperate man, and desperate men were vicious when cornered. If Simon left her here, he was leaving her to a wolf. He walked to the doorway and kicked the heavy iron hasp. It skittered across the floorboards into the dark hallway. "Then don't stay here," Simon said. He didn't turn around. He stood in the broken threshold, looking out into the pitch-black corridor. Imogen stared at his broad back. "What?" Simon turned slowly. "I said don't stay here. Get up." Imogen didn't move. Her hands gripped the faded wool of her skirt so tightly her knuckles were stark white. "Where would I go? The staff?" "Forget the staff," Simon barked, his patience finally fraying. It wasn't directed at her, but at the sheer absurdity of the situation. "I am walking out of this house, Imogen. I am walking down those stairs. I am calling for my carriage, and I am leaving. I am asking you to walk out with me." The silence that followed was deafening. The only sound was the soft, dying hiss of the embers in the grate. Imogen felt the blood drain entirely from her head. The room spun. Leave. The word was entirely foreign. It was a concept that belonged to other people, people with whole faces, people who didn't cause women to faint and children to throw stones. I cannot," she stammered, shrinking back against the hearth. "My face. The light downstairs. The guests." "The guests are drunk, and the gas lamps are terrible," Simon said, taking a step back toward her. "And quite frankly, I do not care if we terrify every aristocratic parasite in the billiards room." "Simon, please," she begged, using his given name without realizing it. Her chest heaved. "I have not crossed that doorframe in 7 years. Simon stopped. The harshness bled out of his posture. He looked at the shattered doorframe, the splinters of oak jutting out like broken teeth. He understood then that the lock hadn't just been on the outside. The true lock was in her mind. He walked back to her. He didn't tower over her this time. He awkwardly lowered himself back down onto one knee, ignoring the sharp twinge in his joint, bringing his face level with hers. "Listen to me," he said, his voice entirely devoid of pity, filled only with a rough, demanding certainty. "You survived the fire. You survived 7 years in a cold room with nothing but bruised fruit and a tyrant for a father. You are stronger than the rotting wood of that door." He held out his hand. His palm was broad, the lifelines deep and dark with old soot that never quite washed away. "I will not drag you," Simon said quietly. "If you tell me to leave alone, I will walk down those stairs and I will never return to Derbyshire. I will leave you your silence." He paused, his dark eyes locked onto her mismatched amber ones. "But if you take my hand, Imogen, I promise you, you will never have to hide in the dark again." Imogen stared at his outstretched hand. The firelight flickered across his calluses. She looked past him, at the open door. The hallway beyond was a maw of darkness. It was terrifying. It was the unknown. It was everything her father had taught her to fear. But then she looked around her room, at the chipped desk, at the broken charcoal, at the heavy, suffocating smell of stale lavender that even the wood smoke couldn't entirely erase. She had died in this room 7 years ago. She looked back at Simon. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't coaxing. He was simply waiting, offering her a bridge of solid earth over a terrifying chasm. Imogen's hand trembled violently as she lifted it from her lap. Her breath hitched, catching in a series of ragged, terrified gasps. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the overwhelming urge to retreat. Slowly, she opened them. She looked at the man of soot and steel. Imogen placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers. The grip was shockingly strong, an anchor in the storm of her panic. He didn't pull her up immediately. He just held her hand, letting her feel the reality of the contact, the absolute permanence of his grip. "All right," Simon murmured, his voice a low, steady rumble. Let's go ruin a dinner party. He pulled her to her feet. The sudden shift in elevation made black spots dance at the edges of Imogen's vision. Her knees threatened to buckle, loose and trembling like unstrung wire. Simon didn't let her fall. He shifted his grip, moving his hand to wrap firmly around her forearm, anchoring her against his side. They stepped over the shattered remnants of the doorframe. The hallway outside was exactly as terrifying as Imogen remembered. The shadows seemed to stretch and pull, clawing at the frayed hem of her gray wool dress. For 7 years, her entire universe had been bounded by 4 peeling walls. Now, the corridor stretched out endlessly, a dark tunnel leading toward the belly of the beast. Keep your eyes on the stairs, Simon murmured, sensing the violent shudder that ripped through her frame. Just the wood in front of your feet, nothing else. Imogen obeyed mechanically, 1 step, then another. Her worn leather slippers made a soft, scuffing sound against the bare floorboards, entirely out of sync with the heavy, uneven thud of Simon's boots. She realized, with a distant, detached sort of horror, that she was sweating. The dampness clung to the back of her neck, chilling her instantly in the drafty air. Her stomach rolled, a nauseating knot of pure panic pulling tight just beneath her ribs. She wanted to vomit. She wanted to rip her arm from his grasp and sprint back to the freezing, familiar dark of her prison. But Simon's grip was iron. It wasn't painful, but it was absolute. He absorbed her trembling, his broad shoulder a solid wall against her left side. As they reached the first landing, the environment began to shift. The smell of damp stone and stale dust gave way to the heavy, cloying scent of beeswax, expensive cigar smoke, and roasted lamb. The temperature rose, suffocatingly warm after the bitter cold of the east wing. Then came the light. The gas sconces on the second floor were lit, hissing softly as they threw a harsh, brilliant white glare across the patterned crimson carpet. Imogen flinched, her right eye watering violently. The light felt abrasive, scraping against her unaccustomed retinas. Her free hand flew up, an involuntary reflex, fingers curling to cover the left side of her face. Simon stopped. They were halfway down the grand curving staircase that spilled into the main foyer. Drop your hand, Imogen, he said. The words were a quiet command, rumbling beneath the distant murmur of masculine voices echoing from the hallway below. The light, she choked out, her voice a humiliated, ragged wheeze. It's too bright. They will see. That is the entire point. Simon turned his head to look at her. In the harsh gaslight, the violent topography of her scars was starkly illuminated. The pearlescent white tissue, the pulled, puckered skin, the missing eyebrow. He didn't look away. If you cover it, you are telling them they have a right to be disgusted. You are apologizing for surviving. Imogen squeezed her eyes shut. Tears, hot and shameful, leaked from the corners. I am not brave like you. I'm not brave. I'm simply too stubborn to let fools dictate my existence. Simon reached out. He didn't pull her hand away by force. He simply wrapped his rough, soot-stained fingers over her trembling knuckles and waited. Drop the hand, Imogen. Let them choke on it. A burst of raucous laughter erupted from the ground floor, followed by the sharp, distinct clack of billiard balls. It was her father's laugh, loud, performative, and entirely hollow. A sudden sharp spike of something incredibly hot flared in Imogen's chest. It wasn't courage. It was anger. A tiny, long-buried spark of pure, unadulterated rage at the man laughing downstairs while she froze in the dark. Slowly, agonizingly, Imogen lowered her hand. She left it resting at her side, her fingers curled into a tight fist against her skirt. She opened her eyes, turning her ruined profile fully toward the hissing gas lamp. Simon nodded once, a sharp, approving jerk of his chin. Good. They continued their descent. The grand foyer was deserted, the footmen having retreated to the kitchens to deal with the mountain of dirty china. The double doors to the billiards room were closed, but the thick mahogany couldn't muffle the sounds of the men inside. Imogen's heart slammed against her ribs with the force of a hammer. Each beat echoed in her ears. She was a ghost walking into the sun. She looked down at her dress, faded, stained with old ink and ash, the hem frayed. She looked at Simon's impeccably tailored evening coat, ruined only by the soot on his knees and the dark smear of charcoal across his knuckles. They reached the floor. The crimson carpet was thick, silencing their footsteps. Simon didn't pause to let her gather her breath. He didn't offer a reassuring smile. He simply marched straight toward the double doors, dragging her along in his wake. He didn't knock. He reached out with his free hand, grasped the heavy brass handle, and shoved the doors inward with enough force to bang them violently against the walls. The laughter in the billiards room died instantly, severed as neatly as a hangman's rope. The room was thick with a hazy blue cloud of tobacco smoke. 6 men, all dressed in varying degrees of opulent evening wear, stood frozen around the green baize table. At the head of the table, cue-stick in hand, stood Lord Thomas Ashcroft. His cheeks were flushed with brandy, his waistcoat unbuttoned. For a terrifying, agonizing second, no one moved. The only sound was the soft hiss of the gaslight and the faint rattle of rain against the heavy window panes. Lord Ashcroft's eyes landed on Simon first. His mouth stretched into a wide, accommodating smile. "Your Grace, we thought you had retired for the evening. Come, take a cue. We are just—" His eyes shifted slightly to the left. He saw her. The cue stick slipped from Lord Ashcroft's hand, hitting the parquet floor with a sharp wooden clatter that made Imogen violently flinch. The color drained from his face with sickening speed, leaving his skin the color of dirty parchment. His jaw fell open, a small, pathetic wheezing sound escaping his throat. The other men turned, following his gaze. Imogen wanted the floor to open and swallow her. The collective weight of their stares was a physical pressure crushing her lungs. She saw the immediate, visceral reactions. One man took a sharp step backward, bumping into the brass rail of the fireplace. Another raised his hand to his mouth, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and revulsion. She felt her arm twitch, the desperate, ingrained instinct to raise her hand to her face, screaming through her nerves. But Simon's grip on her forearm tightened just a fraction, a grounding wire. "What?" Lord Ashcroft stammered, his voice stripped of its booming confidence, reduced to a reedy squeak. "What is the meaning of this?" "I found a structural defect in your home, Ashcroft," Simon said. His voice was entirely calm, a low, gravelly rumble that cut through the heavy silence like a serrated blade. "A locked door on the 3rd floor. I took the liberty of removing the rot." Lord Ashcroft's eyes darted frantically between Simon's impassive face and Imogen's scarred one. Panic, raw and ugly, twisted his features. "Your Grace, you do not understand. This is an invalid, a poor, deranged creature the estate took pity on. She is dangerous. You must step away from her." Imogen gasped, the lie hitting her like a physical blow. Deranged creature. After 7 years of silence, he was erasing her entirely. She has an alarming tendency to bite, does she?" Simon asked, stepping further into the room, pulling Imogen with him. He didn't release her arm. "Strange. She seems perfectly lucid to me. She even introduced herself. Imogen Ashcroft, I believe." The name dropped into the room like a live grenade. The other men, investors, peers, gossips, exchanged horrified, bewildered glances. "Imogen Ashcroft died of a fever 5 years ago," a stout man with impressive sideburns muttered, looking at Lord Ashcroft in confusion. "She did." Ashcroft lied desperately, sweat beading heavily on his forehead. This woman is confused. A tragic case of delusion. She worked in the scullery until she was burned, and the trauma broke her mind. She believes she is my daughter." He took a step forward, extending a trembling hand toward Imogen. "Come here, girl. The housekeeper will take you back to your quarters. You are disturbing his grace." Imogen shrank back, pressing her shoulder against Simon's chest. The proximity of her father, the smell of his brandy, triggered a wave of visceral terror. She couldn't speak. Her throat was a desert. Simon moved. He didn't just step in front of her. He shifted his entire massive frame, blocking Ashcroft's path completely. "Touch her," Simon said, the volume of his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly murmur. "And I will break your arm in 3 places. I do not care if we are standing in your home." Lord Ashcroft froze, his hand suspended in midair. He looked at the Duke of Alderley, realizing for the first time that the man in front of him wasn't a civilized peer who played by London society rules. He was a ruthless industrialist who had built an empire with his bare hands. "Your Grace, this is an internal family matter," Ashcroft pleaded, dropping his hand, his voice dropping to a pathetic whine. "The girl's mind is gone. Her face, you can see for yourself. It is a tragedy, but we must protect society from such a shock. We protect her from herself." "You protect your ledger," Simon spat, the disgust finally breaking through his flat affect. He let go of Imogen's arm, but stayed firmly planted between her and the room. He reached into his coat and pulled out the rolled parchment of Imogen's charcoal sketch. He tossed it onto the green baize of the billiards table. It unrolled slightly, revealing the vicious, mocking caricature of Ashcroft bowing to the smokestack. "Your deranged scullery maid drew that an hour ago," Simon said. "She has a sharper grasp of your financial desperation than your own accountants. She's no more mad than I am. She's simply scarred. And you, Ashcroft, are a coward who locked his own flesh and blood in a freezing room because she ruined the aesthetic of your dining table." A collective murmur rippled through the men. The scandal was cementing itself right in front of their eyes. Lord Ashcroft's reputation was disintegrating faster than wet sugar. "My railway," Ashcroft croaked, trying to salvage the wreckage. "The contract." "There is no contract," Simon said coldly. "Your Derbyshire lands are a swamp. Your financial records are a work of fiction. And even if your land was paved in solid gold, I would sooner set my own mills on fire than do business with a man who fastens a padlock to the outside of his daughter's bedroom door." Simon turned his back on Lord Ashcroft. He didn't look at the other men. He looked only at Imogen. She was trembling, her chest heaving, her mismatched eyes wide and fixed on his face. She hadn't spoken a word, but she hadn't run away. She had stood in the light. Simon offered his arm to her, not his hand to drag her, but his arm bent at the elbow. A formal, deliberate gesture of respect in front of a room full of men who viewed her as a monster. "My carriage is waiting," Simon said, his voice dropping the harsh gravel, returning to the steady, grounded tone he had used in the dark. "Derbyshire is too damp. Will you allow me to escort you to the north, Imogen?" Imogen stared at the offered sleeve of his coat. She looked past him, catching a glimpse of her father. Lord Ashcroft was leaning heavily against the billiards table, his head in his hands, completely broken. For the first time in 7 years he looked small. She took a breath. The air in the room was thick with smoke and shock, but it tasted sweeter than the stale lavender of the east wing. Imogen raised her trembling hand and slid it through the crook of Simon's arm. Her fingers gripped the heavy wool fabric like a lifeline. "Yes," Imogen rasped, her voice rough, imperfect, but finally loud enough to be heard. "Please." The rain had turned to a driving, freezing sleet by the time they reached the portico. The heavy oak front doors of Ashcroft Manor slammed shut behind them, the sound echoing like a cannon shot over the crunch of the gravel. A terrified young footman, drenched to the bone, struggled to hold a black umbrella steady against the wind as he opened the door to Simon's waiting carriage. Imogen didn't wait for the umbrella. She stepped out from the shelter of the portico into the biting cold. The freezing rain hit her face, stinging the tight scar tissue on her left cheek and soaking into the thin wool of her dress instantly. It was a miserable, punishing weather. It felt magnificent. It was movement. It was sensation. It was the sky, unmediated by a dirty, rippled window pane. Simon guided her quickly up the metal steps into the carriage. He followed, his bad knee buckling slightly as he hauled himself inside. He slammed the carriage door shut himself, plunging them into the dim, leather-scented interior. "Alderley!" Simon barked, banging his cane twice against the roof. The driver cracked the whip, and the carriage lurched violently forward, the iron-rimmed wheels grinding against the gravel. They were moving. The adrenaline that had held Imogen upright in the billiards room evaporated the moment the carriage passed through the towering iron gates of the estate. The crash was physical. She collapsed back against the tufted leather squabs, her entire body seized by a violent, uncontrollable tremor. Her teeth chattered audibly. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around her legs, trying to make herself as small as possible. She had done it. She had walked out. The enormity of the rupture, the total annihilation of the only life she had known for 7 years, crashed over her. She had no clothes, no money, no chaperone. She was entirely at the mercy of a blunt, cynical duke she had met 2 hours ago. A heavy, incredibly warm weight suddenly fell over her shoulders. Simon had taken off his dark wool overcoat. He draped it around her, the thick fabric engulfing her completely. It smelled intensely of that peaty whiskey, rain, and cold tobacco. The heavy wool trapped her own body heat, slowly easing the vicious shivering. "Drink," Simon said. He didn't hand her the flask this time. He was holding a small silver cup, poured from a crystal decanter secured in the carriage wall. Imogen's hands were shaking too badly to take it. Simon realized this immediately. He didn't make a fuss. He simply slid closer on the leather bench, wrapped his large hand over her cold, trembling fingers, and guided the cup to her lips. She drank the brandy. It was smoother than the whiskey, burning a warm, golden trail down her throat. She swallowed, coughing slightly, and leaned back against the seat. Simon pulled his hand away and retreated to his corner of the carriage. He didn't try to hold her hand. He didn't try to comfort her with empty platitudes about how everything would be wonderful now. He knew better. He knew trauma didn't evaporate because you crossed a threshold. The carriage hit a rut in the road, swaying heavily. The faint glow from the carriage lanterns threw shifting shadows across Simon's face. He was looking out the window into the black, rain-swept countryside, rubbing his bad knee with a grimace. "You ruined him," Imogen said. Her voice was barely a whisper over the sound of the wheels, still raspy, still rough. Simon didn't look away from the window. "He ruined himself. I merely supplied the audience. The society papers will print it by Tuesday. The Duke of Alderley absconding in the night with the disfigured, resurrected daughter of Lord Ashcroft." Imogen pulled the oversized coat tighter around her throat. "Your reputation will be dragged through the mud." Simon finally turned his head, his deep-set eyes locked onto hers in the dim light. A slow, cynical half-smile touched the corner of his mouth, the first genuine smile she had seen from him. "Imogen," he said, the gravel in his voice warm and steady. "I am a northern industrialist who makes his fortune selling steel and coal. Society already thinks I am a barbarian who eats with his hands. I assure you my reputation is entirely mud-proof." Imogen stared at him. The sheer, immovable pragmatism of the man was staggering. He had walked into a house of ghosts, kicked down a locked door, publicly immolated a lord, and stolen a ruined woman, all with the same emotional detachment one might use to negotiate a shipping route. Yet, as she looked at him, at the soot permanently stained into his knuckles and the tired lines around his eyes, she saw the profound respect in his distance. He wasn't looking at her like a victim. He wasn't looking at her like a charity case. He was looking at her like a survivor. "What happens when we reach Alderley?" Imogen asked. The panic was receding, replaced by a cautious, fragile curiosity. "You will have a room," Simon answered plainly. "One with a lock on the inside. You will have a fire that does not run out on Tuesdays. You will eat hot food. If you wish to draw, I will buy you graphite and clean paper. If you wish to walk in the gardens, you will walk in the gardens." He paused, resting his arm against the carriage door. If anyone stares at you, I will fire them, Simon added, his tone entirely serious. And if you ever decide you wish to leave, I'll put you on a train to wherever you desire to go. It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't a fairy tale promise of a magical cure for her scars, or a sudden, miraculous romance. It was better. It was agency. It was freedom. Imogen slowly lowered her legs from her chest. She let the heavy coat fall slightly open, the warmth having finally soaked into her bones. She turned her head toward the small carriage window. The glass was fogged with their breath, but she reached out and wiped a small circle clear with the side of her hand. Outside, the darkness was absolute, broken only by the fleeting shadows of trees rushing past in the rain. She looked at her reflection in the dark glass. She saw the scarred cheek, the ruined eye. It didn't look any less severe. It didn't look any less violent. But for the first time in 7 years, she didn't immediately look away. She stared at the reflection of the woman who had walked down the stairs, the woman who had left the ghost behind. Imogen let out a long, quiet breath. The tight, puckered skin on her left cheek pulled sharply as the corner of her mouth lifted. "I believe," Imogen whispered to the glass, "I would like some clean paper." Simon heard her over the rain. He leaned his head back against the leather, closing his eyes as the carriage rattled onward into the cold, open night. Done! Did Imogen's raw courage and Simon's brutal, unwavering honesty keep you hooked until the final carriage ride? The wounds of the past rarely heal overnight, but sometimes all it takes is a broken lock and the right ally to step out of the dark. If you love this deeply grounded, gritty historical romance, hit that like button and share this story with someone who appreciates a protagonist with real scars and a strong spine. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more raw, emotional audio dramas. Drop a comment below. What was your favorite sensory detail?